The U.S. soldier who was captured escaped, got captured again, escaped again. 7 times. What you are about to hear is drawn from first-hand accounts, military records, and the personal testimonies of American prisoners of war held in Europe and the Pacific between 1942 and 1945. The events in this story reflect what actually happened to real men in real camps, reconstructed from the documents and diaries and court records that survived the war and that tell us, in precise and often uncomfortable detail, exactly what it took to refuse to stay captured. This is not a story about one lucky escape. This is a story about a man who treated capture the way most men treat a bad hand of cards, as a temporary condition that required a response, not an acceptance. He was captured 7 times. He escaped 7 times. The Germans who caught him the last time were so tired of dealing with him that they sent him to a camp that had never had a successful escape in 3 years of operation. He escaped from that one, too. His name was James Roy Calder, and he was born on June 14, 1921, in Butte, Montana, which is a city that was built on copper mining and that produced, over the course of its history, a specific kind of man, the kind who understood that the ground was hard and the work was harder, and that complaining about either was a waste of breath that could be used for something more productive. His father, Thomas Calder, worked the mines for 22 years, a big, quiet man with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same rock he spent his days extracting copper from, who came home every evening smelling of dynamite and earth, and who ate his dinner and went to bed and got up and did it again, because that was what the work required, and the work was what kept the family fed. His mother, Agnes, was a Scottish immigrant who had arrived in Montana at 16 with nothing except the specific ferocity of a woman who has decided that the circumstances she was born into are not the circumstances she is going to die in, and who raised her 4 children with the understanding that the world did not owe them anything, but that they owed the world their full effort every single day. James was the youngest of the 4. He was not the biggest or the loudest or the one most likely to be remembered by a casual observer. He was the one who finished things. Every task his father set him, every job his mother assigned, every challenge that school or weather or the particular difficulty of growing up in a mining town during the Depression placed in front of him, James Calder finished. Not always quickly, not always cleanly, but finished. His older brother, Danny, later said that James was the kind of person who, if you locked him in a room with no door, would spend however long it took figuring out how the walls were attached and then take one of them apart. This was not a metaphor. It was a description of something James had actually done at age 14 when their father accidentally locked the cellar from the outside and left for work without realizing James was inside. James was out in 40 minutes. He used a canning jar, a length of wire, and a coal shovel, and the wall he took apart was put back together so precisely that Thomas Calder did not notice it had been disturbed for 3 weeks. James Calder enlisted in the Army in March of 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, at age 20. He was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division and trained for infantry combat at Fort Benning, Georgia, where his drill sergeant, a career Army man named Sergeant First Class Howard Webb, wrote in his evaluation that Private Calder was not the fastest man in the platoon or the strongest, but was the most difficult to stop once he had decided to do something, which Webb noted could be either an asset or a problem, depending on what Calder decided to do. Webb was more right about this than he knew. Calder shipped to England in late 1942 and was in North Africa by early 1943, part of the Allied campaign to push the German and Italian forces out of the continent that would eventually lead to the invasion of Sicily and then Italy itself. He was in the mountains south of Kasserine Pass in February of 1943 when the Germans launched the offensive that became one of the most painful early lessons the American Army received about the difference between training for war and fighting one. His unit was overrun. He was captured for the first time on February 14, 1943. He was a prisoner of war for 11 days. The first escape was the simplest, which is not the same as saying it was simple. He was being transported by truck with 14 other American prisoners toward a German processing camp when the truck stopped at a crossroads to allow a German armor column to pass. The guards were watching the armor. Calder was watching the guards. The truck had wooden slat sides, not solid panels, and the slats had gaps between them of approximately 3 inches, which was not enough to squeeze through, but was enough to work a hand through, which was enough to reach the latch on the tailgate, which was a standard German military vehicle latch that operated on a simple lever mechanism, which Calder had identified and memorized in the first 4 minutes after being loaded onto the truck, because identifying and memorizing the mechanism of any enclosure he found himself inside had become, by age 21, as automatic for James Calder as breathing. He opened the tailgate quietly while the guards watched the armor. He dropped to the road. He rolled under the truck and stayed there until the armor column had passed and the truck had moved on. And then he was alone on a road in Tunisia with no map, no food, no water, and no particular plan beyond the understanding that any direction away from the truck was better than any direction toward it. He walked for 4 days, moving at night, hiding during the day, eating what the desert offered, which was almost nothing, until he encountered a British patrol from the 8th Army who took him in and fed him and eventually returned him to his unit. He had lost 11 pounds. He reported for duty the next morning. When his commanding officer asked him how he had gotten back, Calder said, "Walked mostly, sir." This was accurate. The second capture happened 6 weeks later in March of 1943 during a patrol action in which his unit encountered a German position that was considerably larger than intelligence had suggested. He was taken with 3 other men and transported to a prisoner of war camp in Italy, a facility near Chieti in the Abruzzo region that held several hundred Allied prisoners under the supervision of Italian guards who were, by the spring of 1943, fighting a war that a significant portion of them no longer believed in, and who brought to their guard duties the specific lack of enthusiasm of men going through motions they expected to stop going through soon. Calder spent 8 days studying the camp, the guard rotations, the fence construction, the drainage system, and the habits of the Italian guards, paying particular attention to one guard on the night shift who had a routine of stopping at the same point on his patrol route every night at approximately the same time to smoke a cigarette, which created a window of approximately 4 minutes during which a section of the perimeter fence was unobserved. On the 9th night, Calder went through that section of fence. He had cut the wire over 3 consecutive nights using a piece of metal he had worked loose from his bunk frame, cutting a few strands each night and bending them back so the damage was not visible during daylight inspections. He was out of the camp before the guard finished his cigarette. He moved south through the Italian mountains for 12 days, guided partly by a compass he had fashioned from a sewing needle and a piece of thread, and partly by the stars, and partly by the directional instinct of a man who had grown up navigating the mountains of Montana and who understood high terrain the way city men understand streets. He made contact with Italian partisans who helped him reach Allied lines. He was back with his unit in April of 1943. He had been a prisoner for 9 days and an escaped prisoner for 12. When his unit commander asked for an after-action report, Calder produced 4 pages of handwritten notes documenting the layout of the camp, the guard rotations, the fence construction, the Italian guards' morale, and the terrain between the camp and Allied lines. The intelligence officer who reviewed the notes sent a copy to Army headquarters with a cover letter describing them as the most operationally useful prisoner of war report he had received in the North African campaign. The third capture was in Sicily in July of 1943, the fourth in Italy in September, the fifth in France in July of 1944, 1 month after the Normandy landing. Each capture followed a similar pattern in the sense that Calder was taken in combat situations where his unit was overwhelmed or outmaneuvered and where individual soldiers had no option except surrender or death. Each capture was followed by a period of assessment, quiet and systematic and completely internal, during which Calder catalogued his environment with the thoroughness of a man who understood that escape was not a matter of courage, but of information, and that the collection of information was a discipline that required patience and methodical attention rather than the dramatic urgency that movies would later suggest. Each escape was different because each camp and each situation was different, and because Calder understood that a method used once was a method that guards would anticipate. The third escape took 6 days and involved a drainage culvert, a German officer's coat obtained through means that Calder described in his debrief as a trade the officer probably regretted, and 40 miles of walking through the Sicilian interior at night. The fourth escape took 3 days and involved hiding in a vegetable delivery cart for the first 12 miles, which Calder described as effective but uncomfortable on account of the turnips. The fifth escape from a camp in eastern France in the summer of 1944 was the most technically sophisticated of the first 5, involving a tunnel that Calder had organized and partially dug himself over a period of 19 days, working at night, disposing of the soil by distributing it inside his clothing and releasing it gradually during the daily exercise period, a technique he had read about in a report on British prisoner of war escape methods that had been circulated among Allied troops before the Normandy landing as a kind of contingency education on the reasonable institutional assumption that some percentage of the men reading it would eventually need it. 11 men went through the tunnel. 10 made it out. 1 was recaptured at the wire. The other 9, including Calder, scattered into the French countryside, and 7 of them eventually reached Allied lines. Calder was back with his unit in August of 1944, having been a prisoner for 22 days and an escaped prisoner for 9. He was awarded the Bronze Star for the tunnel operation. He was back in the line within a week. The 6th capture happened in the Hürtgen Forest in November of 1944, which is a name that every student of the Second World War knows as the designation for one of the most costly and mismanaged American operations of the European campaign. The Hürtgen Forest was a dense and dark expanse of German pine forest near the Belgian border where the army sent division after division into terrain that was perfectly suited to the German defensive tactics of 1944, where artillery shells fused on the treetops and rained shrapnel straight down on men who had no cover from above, where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards, where the cold was a weapon as effective as any the Germans deployed. Calder's unit was part of the 4th Infantry Division's assault on the forest in November, and the assault went the way most assaults on the Hurtgen went, which is to say, badly and at great cost. He was separated from his unit in a firefight that lasted 40 minutes and produced casualties that accounted for a third of his company, and he was taken by a German patrol that was sweeping the forest for exactly the kind of isolated American soldiers that the fighting produced in quantity. He was the only prisoner taken by that patrol. They looked at his tags, saw his name, and one of the German soldiers said something to the others that Calder did not understand at the time because his German was functional but not fluent. He learned later from a German prisoner who had been in the same unit that what the soldier had said was, "This is the one who keeps escaping. Tell the camp to watch him." His reputation had preceded him. The Germans were keeping a file. This was, Calder later said in his debriefing, one of the more satisfying discoveries of his time as a prisoner of war. The understanding that the enemy had noticed him specifically and had developed institutional anxiety about him specifically, which meant that his escapes had cost the German military not just the inconvenience of a missing prisoner, but the administrative burden of tracking and anticipating one particular American soldier's consistent refusal to remain where they put him. He was sent to Stalag Luft III in Poland, the camp that had been the site of the Great Escape in March of 1944, the mass breakout of 76 Allied prisoners that had resulted in the recapture of all but 3 and the execution of 50 by the Gestapo on Hitler's direct order. The camp after the Great Escape was a different facility from the one that had allowed it. The Germans had added guard towers, increased patrols, installed microphones under the barracks floors to detect tunneling, and brought in a camp commandant who had made escape prevention his professional specialty. It was the most secure prisoner of war facility in the German system. Calder was there for 31 days. He escaped on the 32nd. The 6th escape was not through a tunnel. Tunneling was expected, and the microphones made it suicidal. It was not through the wire, because the wire at Stalag Luft III after the Great Escape was monitored with a thoroughness that made wire cutting a short route to a guard tower bullet. It was through the front gate in a German uniform with papers that Calder had spent 31 days manufacturing with the help of 2 British prisoners who were the best forgers in the camp and who had been working on document production since before Calder arrived. The papers identified him as a German supply corporal delivering a requisition to the administrative office outside the main compound. The uniform had been assembled piece by piece through trades and thefts, and one particularly audacious removal from a guard's locker during the confusion of a fire drill that Calder had engineered by setting fire to a small pile of carefully selected materials in a corner of the recreation yard in a way that produced a great deal of smoke and very little actual flame. He walked through the front gate of Stalag Luft III on a Tuesday morning in January of 1945, carrying a clipboard with papers that would not have survived close scrutiny and did not have to because he moved through the gate with the specific purposeful confidence of a man who belongs exactly where he is, which is a quality that Calder had developed over 5 previous escapes into something that functioned almost like a physical disguise. He was in Poland in January in a German uniform with no resources and Soviet forces advancing from the east and American forces still weeks away to the west. He moved east. He found the Soviet advance in 11 days. The Soviets held him for 3 days before accepting that he was American and transferring him to American liaison officers. He was back in Allied custody in February of 1945 and back with a unit, a different one since his original had been reorganized, in March. The 7th capture was the last one, and it was the one that produced the only moment in James Calder's war when the people who had been chasing him finally had something to say that he found worth listening to. It happened in April of 1945, 3 weeks before the German surrender, in a village in western Germany where his unit encountered a German rear guard that was fighting with the specific intensity of men who knew the war was over and were fighting anyway because they did not know what else to do. He was taken alone when his squad was separated in the street fighting, marched at gunpoint to a German command post in a farmhouse, and presented to a German major named Wilhelm Frenzel, who spoke English and who looked at Calder's dog tags and then looked at the file he had pulled from a case on the table, a file that Calder could see contained his name and a considerable amount of documentation, and said in English, "You are James Calder." Calder said yes. Frenzel looked at the file and then looked at Calder and said, "You have escaped 6 times." Calder said yes. Frenzel said, "The war will be over in 3 weeks, perhaps 4. I have a proposal. You stay here. You do not attempt to escape. In 3 weeks, you go home. Otherwise, I have to send you somewhere and post additional guards and write additional reports. And frankly, Sergeant Calder, I am tired of writing reports about you." Calder looked at the German major across the table. He looked at the file with his name on it. He considered the proposal with the same methodical attention he brought to every situation that required a decision. Then he said, "Major, I appreciate the offer, but I'm going to have to decline." Frenzel looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I assumed you would say that." He sent Calder to a small holding facility in a nearby town with 4 guards and instructions to watch him continuously. Calder escaped on the 3rd day by convincing one of the guards that there was a structural problem with the floor of his cell that needed immediate attention, and when the guard came in to look at the floor, Calder was no longer in the cell because he had been in the ceiling for the previous 4 hours, having worked loose a ceiling panel 2 nights earlier and replaced it so carefully that no one had noticed. He walked west and found American forces in 2 days. He was debriefed for the 7th time on April 29, 1945. Germany surrendered 9 days later. James Roy Calder was discharged from the Army in December of 1945 with the rank of Staff Sergeant and 3 Bronze Stars and a collection of debrief reports that the Army's Prisoner of War Research Division used extensively in developing the escape and evasion training program that became standard in the post-war military. He went home to Butte, Montana. His father was still working the mines. His mother had kept his room exactly as he had left it in March of 1942. He went back to work, not in the mines, he had spent enough time underground, but in construction, where his ability to look at a structure and understand immediately how it was put together, and therefore how it could be taken apart, made him a foreman by 1948 and a contractor by 1952.
He married a woman named Patricia in 1947, a nurse who had served in the Army Medical Corps in the Pacific, and who had her own understanding of what the war had asked of people and what it had taken from them, and who recognized in James Calder the specific quality of a man who has been tested past every normal limit and has discovered something about himself in the testing that he will carry for the rest of his life. They had 3 children and lived in Butte until 1963, when they moved to Billings for the school system and stayed there for the next 30 years. He did not talk about the escapes in public. He talked about them privately, to Patricia To his children when they were old enough? To the occasional researcher or journalist who found his name in the Army's prisoner of war records and tracked him down with questions? He was always precise in these conversations, detailed and accurate and without embellishment, because embellishment was not a mode he had ever found useful, and because the actual events were sufficiently remarkable without it. When his son Robert asked him once what he thought about during the escapes, during the hours and days of moving through enemy territory alone with no resources and no certainty of survival, Calder thought about it for a moment and then said, "I thought about the next thing that needed doing. Same as always." Robert Calder said that his father delivered this as a simple statement of fact, without drama or false modesty, the way a man describes the obvious, which, for James Roy Calder, is exactly what it was. The next thing needed doing. So he did it. 7 times.